Joining me now is Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at The Australian. Paul, first, where are we at with China? As you wrote in the paper, despite the posturing, we might actually see student numbers from China rise, not fall.
Well, that might happen, but essentially what happened this week, Kieran, was we saw Beijing continue its campaign against Australia, raising this time the warning of racism in Australia against Chinese students. This is a time-honoured technique that China uses against Australia. The response of the government was very strong. Scott Morrison said, well, look, I'm not the one damaging this relationship. The Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, accused Beijing of running a disinformation campaign, stressed that Australia was overwhelmingly a safe and welcoming place for Chinese students. And we saw at the end of the week the government indicate that it will have a pilot program to bring international students back to this country. Now, the fascinating issue here, as you've just indicated, Kieran, is what happens with the Chinese students. I mean, the universities need them in a financial sense. They're far too dependent on Chinese students, so it's very, very important that as far as the universities are concerned, that the flow of international students is re-established. China's given these warnings, but as you say, the fascinating thing, and I think there's a lot of awareness of this in China, is that Australia's done very well combating the virus, particularly compared to Britain and America, which are rival student markets. So you can't rule out, I think, the possibility that we might actually see a very strong return of Chinese students.
Yep, indeed. And on another aspect of our economic reopening, in recent days we've seen, both in terms of social restrictions and a schedule to reopen the interstate borders, that process continue, Paul.
This is good news for Scott Morrison and follows the sustained pressure that Morrison has put on the states. So we saw the National Cabinet decision on Friday. So they foreshadowed that there'll be an easing of restrictions on indoor gatherings and outdoor gatherings, particularly in stadiums. We've seen both Queensland and South Australia identify July timetables for the reopening of the borders. That's really important for the aviation sector and for the tourist sector in terms of future planning. So the restarting of the economy, of the private sector economy, is really critical at this stage. I think it's also interesting that we saw the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, tell the party room this week that there would be a fundamental difference between the government and Labor in terms of the recovery and subsequent phase, that the government saw the role of the public sector as an enabler, as opposed to Labor, with Frydenberg saying that Labor saw the government as the essential solution here, as a spender and provider.
Paul, to the United States now, where we've seen those protests continue, the divide in the United States on show yet again, and we're now only 4.5 months away from the presidential election. How is this continuing to play out in that sense, and Donald Trump's presidency and his re-election bid?
There are really ominous warning signs now coming from the United States, Kieran. And this is not just in terms of the divided country and the protests in the streets. What we are now seeing is evidence in a number of states that there's been a significant increase in infections. Texas, Arizona, Florida, but also a wide range of other states. The critical question here is whether the United States economy is reopening before making sufficient progress in terms of combating and containing the virus. It's summer in America, people want to get out. We've had all the street demonstrations, we've got people moving around, and we've had enormous pressure on state governors to reopen the economy. There are now warnings coming from senior health officials inside the United States that there could be a significant increase in the death toll. We've had 115,000 Americans die, and the health warnings are this could go up to 170,000, 180,000 by September or October. Now, of course, this takes us right to the eve of the presidential election, and one of the ominous signs for Donald Trump would be if in the run-up to the election we saw a second wave of infections and deaths.
Indeed. And finally, Paul, if we return home for the discussion around race relations and the issue locally, the Prime Minister made some remarks on radio about slavery in Australia, or, you know, the lack of that happening in this country. What did you make of the discussion around that?
Well, I think it's been a very confused and misleading discussion, Kieran, to say the least. Scott Morrison said there'd been no slavery in Australia. Now, that's not correct. That's an exaggeration. He then said at the end of the week that he didn't mean to give offence by making those comments, and if people took offence, he apologised. I mean, there was at various stages cheap Aboriginal labour and slave labour used in Australia at different times, indentured labour for farmers and squatters, particularly Aboriginals being forced to work in industries in Northern Australia, in prison gangs and so on. But in a broader sense, I think Scott Morrison was more correct than his critics, particularly in relation to what he said about the Foundation of New South Wales. The Foundation Governor, Arthur Phillip, spelled out his vision, and this was a vision of Australia that would have convicts, that would have convicts, but would be a free society, a society that had no slaves and no slavery. And essentially that was honoured. At the time of Federation, we saw the Founding Fathers very alert to what had happened in the United States, to slavery in the United States, and most anxious to ensure that Australia did not become a slave society. And in that sense, of course, they repatriated a lot of the South Sea Islanders who were working as cheap labour in Queensland. So the point to make about the Australian Compact and about Australian nationhood is it was founded on a repudiation of slavery. Now, if we're going to have a sensible discussion about our past, then I think we've got to have a comprehensive discussion looking at what happened here on both sides.